Sandhan. All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Hello friends. Today we are going to discuss John Milton's poem on his being arrived to the age of 23. As most of you already know that John Milton was born in 1608 and his date of or year of death is 1674. The age in which John Milton wrote is also known as the Puritan age, but then the age is also known after Milton and it is called the age of Milton. Just as Shakespeare is one of the most prominent writers in English literature, similarly Milton is second to none. In his caliber, in his poetic versatility, in his contribution to literature, Milton stands second to none. He is equal at an equal pedestal with Shakespeare himself. Now, when we look at the poem, we will see that it is a short little poem. Small poems are generally also known as lyrics. So just by looking at the poem, we may say that it appears to be a lyric. But lyrics have various forms as well. There are various types of lyrics as well. Just looking at the poem again, if we count the lines, we will see that this poem consists 14 lines. I have divided the poem here into quatrains and tercets. Quatrain means 4-line stanza, tercet means 3-line stanza. So when we look at the poem, we see that there are 2 quatrains, 2 stanzas that contain 4 lines each, and there are 2 tercets, that is 2 stanzas that contain 3 lines each. If we add them up, we come to know that the poem consists 14 lines. A sonnet is a poem that consists 14 lines, and hence this appears to be a sonnet. But then John Milton did not structure it thus. In John Milton's poems, he does not divide the poem into quatrains and tercets. He divides the poem, he writes the poem in the same way, and the 14 lines continue one after the other. So by looking at the poem, we realize that it is a short poem. It consists 14 lines. It appears to be a sonnet. Now, what is a sonnet? A very broad and general meaning and definition of sonnet could be that the word sonnet comes from Italian sonetto, meaning little song. Sonnet is a small lyrical poem containing 14 lines of iambic pentameter. The iambic pentameter becomes important over here because every poem that contains 14 lines may not be a sonnet. Sonnet has its own form and its own followed by unstressed syllable followed by stressed syllable. That is, when we use words in English, words can be divided into syllables. Syllable in a word can be known by the vowel sound that occurs in a word. And so when we divide a word into divisions according to pronunciation, we know that certain parts of the word are stressed and certain parts of the word are not stressed. Just for an example, if you have the word education, you could say education. So K is stressed over here. Here in an iamb, you have unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. And the second part of the word is pentameter, penta meaning 5. So if we combine the two, we could say that iambic pentameter is 5 sets of unstressed and stressed syllables in each line. So iambic pentameter is the combination of iambic foot which is repeated 5 times in each line. Now coming to the sonnet, there are different types of sonnets. The first type that we'll see today is Italian sonnet. It is believed that sonnet was first practiced in Italy, or the oldest known sonnets are from Italy, and Petrarch was one of the pioneers of this form, as we know. So the Italian sonnet is also known as the Petrarchan sonnet. The Petrarchan sonnet has an octave. Octave means has 8 lines, 2 stanzas of 4 lines each. When they are combined together into one stanza, it becomes a stanza of octave, 8 lines that follow each other into a single stanza. Now that single stanza is important here because that single stanza talks about a single thought and its development. Now this octave is added with a sestet. A sestet would mean 6 lines. So an Italian sonnet or a Petrarchan sonnet is a combination of octave, that is 8 lines, plus sestet, that is 6 lines, and when we combine the two, it becomes 14 lines. And as we have seen earlier, that these 14 lines should be written in iambic pentameter. The other important thing that is essential for any sonnet is there should be a turn or volta between octave and sestet. The turn or volta is a little difference or a turn of thought that occurs. When we look at a sonnet, the first 8 lines in an Italian sonnet express an idea, whereas generally the 9th line talks about a little variation in thought, and that variation, that turn in the thought process, is known as volta or turn. It is an essential part of a sonnet. Next, we see that a sonnet has a peculiar rhyming scheme. At least the Italian sonnet does. The rhyme scheme of the Italian sonnet is generally AB, BA, AB, BA, CDC. This is the rhyme scheme that was popularized by Italian sonnets by pioneers like Petrarch. Now, sestet may have a combination of C and D, that is, the last 6 lines of an Italian sonnet may have different variations of the rhyming scheme of C and D. It could be CDC, CDC, it could be CDE, CDC, or it could even be CDE, CED. Now, what happens is that this slight variation allows the writer to express his emotions in different ways. Just for an example, when we look at the poem that we're discussing today, we'll see how John Milton uses the rhyme scheme in the sestet, and how it is important to the expression of the idea that he is going to express in the poem. The second type of sonnet is known as the English sonnet. The English sonnet is also known as the Shakespearean sonnet. We call it the Shakespearean sonnet because Shakespeare had perfected this sonnet form in England. Shakespeare had written 154 sonnets, and through those 154 sonnets, he had mastered the art or the craft of writing sonnets. He has used his sonnet forms even in his plays. The Shakespearean sonnet is different from the Petrarchan sonnet in its form, as it has 3 quatrains of 4 lines each. As we had discussed earlier, a quatrain is a stanza containing 4 lines. So in a Shakespearean sonnet, you have 3 quatrains of 4 lines each, that is 3 stanzas containing 4 lines each, plus you have a couplet, 2 lines for conclusion. So in a Shakespearean sonnet, the thought is developed in the 12 lines, and the last 2 lines which is a couplet, generally concludes the entire idea. The turn or volta is again essential in Shakespearean sonnet as well, because it is an essential characteristic of a sonnet. The turn or volta generally appears between 8 and 10 lines, 8 or 10 line even in a Shakespearean sonnet. But then Shakespearean sonnet differs largely due to its last couplet, which tries to sum up or conclude the entire development of idea in the above 12 lines. The rhyme scheme of a Shakespearean sonnet is slightly different, as it is AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. The couplet generally rhymes very similar, that is, both the lines rhyme with each other in the couplet, and that concludes the entire idea or the entire thought process that has been discussed in the sonnet. When we talk about the English sonnet, though we know that Shakespeare had perfected the art or the craft of writing sonnets or the English variety of it, but then he was not the pioneer in the use of this form. The form was, it is said, brought to England and first practiced by Thomas Waite and Earl of Surrey. These two gentlemen are credited for pioneering the sonnet form in England. Spenser experimented with the rhyme scheme of sonnet. So even before Shakespeare used the sonnet form as a form of literature or expression in poetry, Thomas Waite, Earl of Surrey, and Spenser experimented with the form of sonnet. But then as Shakespeare has perfected it, as Shakespeare has mastered it or has used it very excellently, the form is known after his name. Spenser, through his experimentations, introduced a different rhyme scheme, which generally was AB, AB, CD, 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 AB, AB, BC, BC, CD, CD, EE. That was the rhyme scheme that was used by Spenser while writing his sonnets. English sonnet was perfected by Shakespeare, as I've already discussed, and that is why the form is also known as, the type of poem is also known as Shakespearean sonnet. Now when we come to Milton's sonnet, Milton, though succeeded Shakespeare in literary traditions, but then he did not follow the English sonnet or the Shakespearean sonnet. Milton, on the other hand, followed the sonnet form that was used by Petrarch. So in place of the flow and verbal luxuriance of the English sonnet, Milton imposed the classical restraint on the sonnet form, and that restraint was important in Miltonic times, as I told you in the beginning of the lecture, that Milton belonged to the Puritan age, whereas Shakespeare belonged to the Romantic age. Now those romantic characteristics can be seen in the use of poetry as well, because when we talk about Shakespeare, Shakespeare's poems generally use verbal luxuriance. They have a flow of imagination, whereas when you talk about Milton and his puritanical ideas, which generally advocated restraint in all walks of life, and even here in the use of poetic form, the classical restraint in the sonnet form was practiced by John Milton through the use of the Petrarchan or the Italian variety of the sonnet. But then he did not imitate the Petrarchan sonnet. He used his own variations to express his different ideas or to express the emotions that he wanted to through the sonnet form, and so he has experimented with the form as well. Conventionally, sonnet is used to express a love or express emotions to address a beloved or a friend. Milton experimented with the form, and Milton used sonnet to express personal feelings as well. just as the poem that we are going to discuss today here tells us about the personal feelings of John Milton. You could even say that this is more of an autobiographical poem because it talks about the life of John Milton and what he thought when he reached this age of 23, where generally youngsters reach their manhood. Coming to the poem that we are going to discuss today, on his being arrived to the age of 23, we see that the poem that has been displayed here before you now is different in structure from the poem that was structurally displayed in the initial slides. First, we had seen that the initial slide contained 2 quatrains and 2 tercets. As I told you, a quatrain is a 4-line stanza and a tercet is a 3-line stanza. So when we combine those 4 and 4 plus 3 and 3, it became 14 lines. Okay, whereas that was again shown to students so that they can identify and they could count easily the lines that are contained in this poem. But then when the poem was published, it looked more or less the way it is shown in this slide, in which the first 8 lines are run-on lines. The first 8 lines here are displayed as one stanza and the last 6 lines are displayed as the second stanza. So instead of the 4 different stanzas that you generally find in let's say a Petrarchan sonnet, or in other, let's say in Shakespearean sonnet where you have 3 different stanzas, let's say 4 different stanzas, here you have 2 different stanzas that are not distinguished through the use of space but through the change in the idea or the turn of thought, the volta as we call it. If we go through the poem, we'll see that the first 8 lines will express an idea. I'll read the poem for you. How soon hath time, the subtle thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 year. My hasting days fly on with full career, but my late spring no bud no blossom showeth. Perhaps my semblance might deceive the truth, that I to manhood am arrived so near, and inward ripeness doth much less appear, that some more timely happy spirits endueth. Yet, be it less or more, or soon or slow, it shall be still in the strictest measure even to that same lot, however mean or high, toward which time leads me, and the will of heaven, all is, if I have grace to use it so, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. Now, in order to comprehend the poem, we will again divide it into quatrains. Quatrains because those 4 lines can be easily read on these slides, and that is why these lines are divided into quatrains. So it's for the practical purpose, but Milton does not divide them in those quatrains. So how soon had time, the subtle thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 year. My hasting days fly on with full career, but my late spring no bud or blossom showeth. These are the first 4 lines that express an idea. Here, if we try to look at the words and if we try to find meanings to those words and to help us paraphrase the poem, it would become easier for us to understand. Just for example, how soon hath time? So here, hath means has. So how soon has time? The subtle thief of youth. Subtle means clever. Clever in the sense of cunning. So here time has been shown as someone who is clever, someone who is very cunning. In the third line we see, my hasting days fly on with full career. The word career here is used and it has a different meaning from what we use it as in the modern context. Career here would mean speed. My hasting days fly on with full career. Hasting days, hasting means passing very quickly. But my late spring no bud or blossom showeth. Late spring here shows you that his late development, his late mental development, not physical development, but his late mental development, or the word that can be replaced here could be maturity. Here, poetic maturity. And but my late spring no bud or blossom showeth. Showeth means shows. So if we paraphrase the first 4 lines using these words and meanings, we would read it in this way: how soon has time, the clever or cunning thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 years. 23 year means 23 year. This poem was written when John Milton was celebrating his 23rd year. My hasting days, so the days that pass very quickly, my hasting days, that means the 23 years of his life that have already passed. Okay, and he thinks that he has not achieved much in those 23 years of his life, and that is why he says my hasting days, the days that pass on very quickly, fly on with full career. And so they fly on the wings of time with full career, that is full speed. But my late spring no bud or blossom showeth. And his late development or late maturity does not show any bloom, does not show any maturity. If we go back to the first stanza, again we find that the word time has been written with a capital T. Generally, if we do not use a capital letter for a word within a sentence, here when a poet uses a word with a capital alphabet, he generally wants to emphasize it, and it has a different meaning for the poem. Here, time is personified. Personification means when you use an inanimate object as someone having life or something that represents life, then that is called personification. When we address an inanimate, that is non-living being or non-living entity, as a person with life, then we call it personification. So how soon had time? Time here has been personified and is addressed as a person. So how soon had time, the subtle youth, the subtle thief of youth. So time is called a thief because time steals our youth. And again, stolen on his wing my 23rd year, that is, time as a thief has stolen his 23 years. So he is very cunning, very subtly he does it, and the hasting days fly. Hasting days passing very quickly again tell us something about the passage of time. Okay, so time has been used metaphorically. When we use the word hasting days, that is used metaphorically, but then when we see the word in the first line itself, time, which is used with the capital alphabet, there time is personified, and time has been personified as a thief of youth. In the second stanza, the second 4 lines that consists the quatrain, the second quatrain that consists the octave of Milton's poem, the second 4 lines read thus: perhaps my semblance might deceive the truth, that I to manhood am arrived so near, and inward ripeness doth much less appear, that some more timely happy spirits end with. Now the idea has been continued, but then as I've said earlier, for the sake of practicality and to show the lines on slide to the students, the 4 lines have been used over here as a quatrain, but then Milton does not let's say structure them thus. Again, if we try to paraphrase them for the benefit of the students, perhaps my semblance means appearance. So perhaps my appearance might deceive the truth, might give the wrong impression. Okay, the appearance, the physical appearance, because physically Milton has already arrived to manhood, but then he thinks that he has still not reached that maturity or that poetic maturity, that Milton mental ripeness, which is essential for a poet. So might give the wrong impression. Perhaps my appearance might deceive the truth, meaning might give the wrong impression that I to manhood am arrived so near, that I have become a man, that I seem to be a grown up man, and inward ripeness doth much less appear. But internally, I still lack that sense of maturity. Okay, he personally he thinks for himself, and he believes that he has not reached that maturity that many of his friends might have reached at this age of 23. Though he had written a few poems before that, but then he had not written enough so that he could be compared with other poets who might have written on having reached this age. An inward ripeness doth less appear, that some more timely happy spirits endueth, that some other friends of Milton might have possessed. Endueth, to endure, here it means to have or possess, or to have reached that mental capability or that mental maturity. He feels that his friends have already reached that mental maturity where they could write poems, and Milton has lacked that mental maturity, even though he has reached that age of manhood, 23 years of his life, which have been stolen away, taken away by time without his realizing it. Because time is a subtle thief, a cunning thief, and Milton, as a poet, has not realized when his 23 years have passed before him. Perhaps my semblance might deceive, the stanza that we were doing here, the truth that I to manhood am arrived so near, and inward ripeness doth much less appear, that some more timely happy spirits endureth. Timely happy, that means achievements corresponding the age of 23, where Milton's friends who have already reached that age of manhood, and they have achieved probably more than what Milton thought that he has achieved. Again, the poem expresses his very personal feelings. This is a personal poem that expresses Milton's personal emotions, and that, again, as I had said earlier, was the use of sonnet in the hands of John Milton, because before him generally sonnet was used to address a beloved, whereas here he is using it as a subject for his own personal inquiry. Endueth, that some more timely spirits endueth. Here endueth means have accomplished or possess. So Milton thinks that he does not possess the maturity that his friends who might have reached that age already possess. Coming to the last 6 lines, yet be it less or more, or soon or slow, it shall be still in the strictest measure even to that same lot, however mean or high, towards which time leads me, and the will of heaven all is, if I have grace to use it so, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. So when we look at these last 6 lines, we come to know that these 6 lines combine the second half or the second part of the sonnet. The idea had been expressed in the first half. In the first 8 lines, Milton laments his late maturity in comparison to his other friends or companions at Oxford. Yet, as we see, Y has been capitalized. Yet be it less or more, soon or slow, and here you find the volta. Here you find the turn from the thought that was being expressed in the first 8 lines, and here you find that there is a turn where he stops lamenting and he thinks that though he may not have achieved the maturity as his friends have achieved, probably he might have achieved less, or probably maturity might come slow to him, but it shall be still in strictest measure even. But still then it should be in the strictest measure or strictest standards. To that same lot, however mean or high. So here, yet be it less or more, for paraphrasing, yet be the maturity less or more, the maturity that he has achieved on reaching the age of 23 in comparison to the maturity, poetic maturity that his friends or companions might have achieved. Okay, he says, though his maturity may be less or more, or soon or slow, it might have come sooner in comparison to some and slower in comparison to others, yet in spite of that, it shall still in strictest measure even. It shall always be in strictest measure. Strictest measure even means strictly and impartially measured. That is, when we use the measure as a standard of recognition, standard of writing poetry, okay, when you are using it as a standard to measure one's maturity, then it will be a standard that will be the same for all, but then some might achieve it, let's say earlier, the others might achieve it late. It shall be still in the strictest measure even to that same lot, however mean or high. Mean means low, okay, however low or high his achievements may have been, towards which time leads me. Here me becomes again important because it's a very personal poem. He's writing about himself, and he says that though he may let's say reach that maturity sooner or later, he might reach it faster or slower, yet it is going to be measured in the strictest sense by a very similar standard towards which time leads me. That is, he believes in the providence of God, in fate, that is what God might have destined for him, so towards which time leads me, and the will of heaven. Will of heaven means the will of God, as is, if I have grace to use it so, if I have blessings of God, benedictions of God, to use my maturity, to use my talent in that manner, then as ever in my taskmaster's eye. Taskmaster, God, who gives each man his task. So if God has given me a task, then I will fulfill it. That is, if providence allows me, I will become a more mature poet. This is very important because Milton took his career of writing poetry very seriously. He wanted to be a successful poet, and at a very early age he had decided that he will choose literature or writing as a vocation, and for that he practiced a lot. And in that sense, when you say that if providence allows me, if it is the will of the heaven, then I will reach my maturity sooner or later, faster or slower. Again, John Milton believed in God, the ways of God to man. Whatever God does for man is important, essential, and probably has a purpose, is an idea that is expressed in many of the poems by John Milton. Just in one of his poems, he says that when he laments that he has not been able to do much to serve God, and then he thinks, after having lost his eyes, he thinks that even those who stand and wait, they also serve who stand and wait. That is, those people who just wait outside the gates of God, who just stand there, they are also serving God, and probably God might have destined them to serve him in that particular way. And so this poem again not only tells us about John Milton's anguish for having reached the age of maturity slower than his companions, it also tells us about his belief in God, fate, or the purpose of life as might have been destined by God. Again, looking at the poem, we could analyze its rhyming scheme. We have already seen that the Italian sonnet has a particular rhyming scheme. It is different from the Shakespearean rhyming scheme, or it is even different from the rhyming scheme that was used by Spenser for the English sonnets that he practiced. As we have already, let's say, discussed, that John Milton uses the Petrarchan form of the sonnet, but then he experiments with the rhyming scheme in the last 6 lines. And not only in this poems, but in this poem, but in various other poems, he uses different variations in the last 6 lines. The first 8 lines generally follow the rhyming scheme that is evident over here. Again, I'll read it for you. How soon had time, the subtle thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 year. My hasting days fly on with full career, but my late spring no bud or blossom sueth. Now, if we see, the first line rhymes with the last line, youth, sueth. The second line, year, rhymes with the third line, career. So, the rhyming scheme would be A, B, B, A, okay, which is how soon had time the subtle thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 year. My hasting days fly on with full career, but my late spring no bud or blossom sueth. Youth, sueth, year, career. In that way, there is, let's say, the rhyming of first line or the last word of the first line rhymes with the last word of the fourth line. The last word of the second line rhymes with the last word of the third rhyme, and so we call this rhyming scheme as A, B, B, A. Okay, how do we come to A, B, B, A? If we suppose that the first pronunciation or first, let's say, first line as it expresses the pronunciation of last word, youth, and we, let's say, call it A. The second line, it has ear, a different pronunciation, and so we call it B. Third line has career, so ear, career are very similar, they rhyme with each other, and so if we have given the alphabet B for ear, then career also rhymes with it, and that is why we use the same alphabet B for career. We had used A for youth, and in the last line, or let's say fourth line, you find sueth, and sueth and youth both rhyme with each other. They are rhyming words, and that is why again we give the same alphabet, we assign the same alphabet A over here, and it becomes A, B, B, A. But my late spring no bud or blossom sueth. Perhaps my semblance might deceive the truth, that I to manhood am arrived so near, and inward ripeness doth much less appear, that some more timely happy spirit endueth. Again, if we look at these lines, the fifth line ends with the word truth, the eighth line ends with the word endueth. So, truth, endueth. The two lines in between, that is the sixth and the seventh line, okay, they end with near and appear. So, near and appear are similar or rhyming words, and that is why both of them have the same alphabet assigned to them, that is BB. Again, when we see youth, which is A, sueth, which is again A, truth, which is again A, endueth, which is again A. So, in those 8 lines, you have the repetition of the same similar sounding word that rhymes with, let's say, the word there that has been used before. And so, if you have the same pronunciation or same rhyming, let's say, sound that repeats, then you assign the same alphabet to it. And so, the rhyming scheme for the octave would be A, B, B, A, A, B, B, A. When we come to the sestet are the last 6 lines, but then the sextet again becomes important here, because the idea that has been expressed in the first 8 lines is being deviated a bit over here. There is a slight distinction in the expression of that idea in the last 6 lines. You could say in the first 8 lines there is a lament, and in the last 6 lines he tries to console himself. So the last 6 lines become important in that sense, and because there is a slight deviation, a slight variation, we could say that the volta or the slight turn in the thought comes with the word yet. Yet means in spite of whatever has been expressed there, in spite of all the grievances, in spite of all the laments for late maturity, yet, be it less or more, or soon or slow, it shall be still in strictest measure even to that same lot, however mean or high, toward which time leads me, and the will of heaven, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. The 6 lines express a similar idea of consolence, and that is why it appears as one stanza. So, yet be it less or more, or soon or slow, it shall be still in the strictest measure even to that same lot, however mean or high, towards which time leads me, and the will of heaven, all is, if I have grace to use it so, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. What comes to our notice is that the sounds that we heard in the last words in the quatrains are not repeated over here. So, youth or truth, which was assigned A, or ear, career, or appear, or near, that was assigned B, such sounds do not appear in the last 6 lines. And so we assign a new alphabet to the first line of the sestet, yet be it less or more, or soon or slow. So slow, we call it C. It shall be still in the strictest measure even. Even again does not rhyme with any of the above, and so we'll have to assign it a different alphabet, and so we call it D. To that same lot, however mean or high. Again, it does not rhyme with any of the above sounds that we have heard before with the word ending those lines, and so we'll have to assign it again a different alphabet, and so it becomes E. So here you have C, D, E. None of these lines rhyme with each other. The first 3 lines of the sestet do not rhyme with each other. Coming to the last 3 lines, towards which time leads me, and the will of heaven, heaven, even. Okay, so you find a rhyming there. All is, if I have grace to use it so, slow. So when we say slow and slow, they are rhyming words, they rhyme with each other, and so you find that there is a different pattern that is used over here. As ever in my great taskmaster's eye, high and I. So the rhyming pattern or the rhyming scheme changes in the sestet. In the sestet, what we find is that the first line of the sestet rhymes with the second last line, and so the rhyming scheme is CDE, DCE. Now these let's say rhyming schemes that are being used in various sonnets by Milton find a variation in these last six lines, because these last 6 lines allow the writer to play with those words and with those emotions of consolence, of let's say bringing down a conclusion or bringing down a consolence to what has been lamented in the first 8 lines. There is this deviation, and for that deviation, in order to emphasize a few words, he may use a particular type of rhyme scheme. Here he uses CDE, DCE. Okay, in other poems he may use CDC, CDC or CDE, CDE, okay, or in various combinations of C and D, which is permissible in the use of Petrarchan or the Italian sonnet. But then Milton used it to perfection. Milton again popularized the Italian form of the sonnet, which again was not practiced during the time of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's age, as most of you know, preceded the age of Milton, and instead of following the great master of literature, William Shakespeare, he follows the traditional form that is available or that has come down to us from Italy, from its use by Petrarch. So here again I'll read the last 6 lines for you. Yet be it less or more, or soon or slow, it shall be still in the strictest measure even to that same lot, however mean or high, towards which time leads me, and the will of heaven, all is, if I have grace to use it so, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. Here again we find that time has been capitalized within a sentence, and again taskmaster's eye, T and M are capital. So time that is personified in the first stanza, that same time is repeated over here as personification, okay, and again the word taskmaster, because it stands for God, and traditionally even the G for God was written with a capital G, okay, though we do not normally let's say use that tradition these days, but then earlier it was required that when you're writing about God, the alphabet should be G, and here again the taskmaster, the word taskmaster refers to God. But then he does not say God, he says taskmaster, and a taskmaster gives us tasks. And Milton feels that if the taskmaster has assigned a particular task to him, then he will also give him the means to fulfill it. That is, he had this faith, he had this belief in God and his providence. Now, looking at this poem, if we go to the background of this poem was composed in 1631 when Milton reached the age of 23. It is a personal or autobiographical poem because here the poet talks about his own inner feelings. He talks about his alleged late maturity. Milton had reached 23 years of age. Time has been personified in this poem, as we have already seen. The octave, that is the first 8 lines, lament poet's lack of spectacular achievement. Not that Milton had not achieved anything, but then Milton thinks that he had not achieved enough in comparison to the other companions or the other poets who might have achieved, let's say, more than him when they had reached that age. So it's a comparative, let's say, sort of an analysis where Milton thinks that he has much to achieve as yet. As we know that Milton was a very prolific writer. Milton was the only writer who had written or penned an epic in English. Okay, most of the students, I think, may know that Paradise Lost, which is the only epic written in let's say English by an Englishman, was written by Milton, and so we know that he had those high standards for himself. He wanted to achieve those high standards, and because he wanted to achieve those high standards, in comparison to what he has achieved, he thinks that it is still mean, it is still low, it's still not enough, and that is why this poem laments his lack of maturity. But then when the poem comes to an end, he consoles himself, and very rightly so. But then this probably becomes a pedestal where Milton aspires to become a greater poet. The volta or the turn takes place in the 9th line beginning yet. In this poem that we have considered, the yet with a capital Y tells you that there is a turn, a slight deviation in the thought which was developing towards sadness or lack of achievement, and here with yet it finds a change and it moves towards consolation, where the poet tries to console himself and say, or let's say, assure himself that if God has assigned something good for him, then he will also give him the means. The sestet turns the regret into hope. There is hope towards the end because he believes in God and in providence and in fate. It expresses hope that he shall soon accomplish things God, the taskmaster, has destined him to do. So whatever God has destined him to do, he will do. Whatever he is sent here to achieve, he will achieve. So the poem, on his being arrived to the age of 23, is a poem by John Milton, and today's discussion tells us about the little nuances that are essential for a sonnet. It clearly tells us that a sonnet is not any poem written in 14 lines. Lines do not matter. It is the structure that is essential, it is the rhyme scheme that is essential, it is the development of thought that is essential, it is the turn of thought that is essential. And with all those characteristics, when they are combined together, it becomes a poem known as the sonnet. More than that, it also talks about the use of the sonnet by a great master of literature, John Milton. John Milton, who had this ability to use words in certain ways that let's say expressed his style, a distinct style, and that style, when he uses that style in the epic, it becomes a grand style. It becomes a style which is very mature, and the lack of maturity that he talks about here is achieved in let's say the poems that follow. Thank you.
Sandhan. All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.